Welcome to Things You Don't Know, where we explore the untold stories of history's forgotten battles and the people who lived them. We're joined today by Patrick Ryan, who you've heard on some of our other podcasts, who's a valuable addition. So say hi, Patrick.
Hello, everyone.
Yeah, we're glad to have you today again with us. Today, we dive into the astonishing world and tale of the Japanese soldiers who refused to surrender after World War II ended. Some fighting for over 2 decades in the dense jungles of the Pacific, long after the world had moved on. They didn't know the war was over. They didn't know. 2 decades on their own, isolated, struggling. Yeah. So on August 15th, 1945, that was the day that Japan's Emperor Hirohito announced the country's surrender to the Allies. For most, this marked the end of a devastating war. But for a handful of Japanese soldiers scattered across these remote islands, the war was not over. They continued fighting, hiding, surviving, and waiting for orders that would never come.
Japanese military instilled in its soldiers a political, religious, and personal code of honor, Bushido. This was the way of the warrior. Surrender was not an option. It was the ultimate disgrace. So many soldiers preferred death to capture, convinced that being taken prisoner was the ultimate dishonor, which would bring shame on themselves, their families, and their community. When the war ended, thousands of Japanese soldiers were stranded on distant islands, cut off from all communication. With no way to verify the surrender, some assumed that any news of peace was barbarian enemy propaganda.
To truly understand the unwavering conviction of these soldiers, we must look back at the ancient code of Bushido. The samurai, Japan's noble warrior class, followed a strict moral code centered around the principles of righteousness, loyalty, honor, and self-discipline. It was not just about fighting. It was about living and dying with purpose.
Hmm. Yeah, it was quite something. For a samurai, death was preferable to disgrace. If a warrior was captured or failed in duty, he was expected to commit seppuku or ritual suicide to preserve his honor. This code of conduct was later absorbed by the Imperial Japanese Army, reinforcing the idea that surrender was shameful and that duty to the emperor was absolute.
This belief system meant that lost soldiers, including two we're going to look at today, Hiro Onoda and Shikoda Yoki, could not conceive of surrender. To them, the war was their only purpose on a lifelong duty, and any suggestion of peace was a trick to weaken their resolve. As we said, to understand the unwavering conviction of these soldiers, we must look back at the ancient code of Bushido. This comes out of the samurai, Japan's noble warrior class, and it was a strict moral code centered around the principles of loyalty, honor, self-discipline, righteousness, and victory at all costs. It was not just about fighting. It was about living and dying with purpose.
Another key element of Bushido was its connection to Japan's emperor, who was considered a living deity. For centuries, The emperor was regarded as a direct descendant of Amaterasu, the sun goddess and the divine ruler of Japan. This belief was deeply ingrained in Japanese society and was further emphasized during the rise of militarism in the early 20th century.
Soldiers were not just fighting for their nation, they were fighting for their divine ruler. Yeah, the emperor was divine, he was divinity. This elevated their duty to a sacred obligation, making surrender unthinkable. They believed that as long as they lived, they must uphold the emperor's will, even if it meant sacrificing everything. When Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, it shattered this deeply held conviction. Many soldiers could not comprehend that their divine leader had commanded them to lay down arms. To them, such an order had to be an enemy deception or a test of their loyalty. This mindset explains why men like Hiro Onoda, Shihoteki Yoko, and Terahuna Nakamura remained steadfast in their belief that the war was still ongoing.
One of the most important of these soldiers was Hiro Onoda, an intelligence officer stationed in the Philippines. When American and Filipino forces overran his headquarters at Lubang Island, Onoda and 3 other soldiers retreated into the jungle, surviving on bananas, stolen livestock, and whatever they could scavenge. To them, the war was still on, and every civilian or local farmer was a potential enemy spy. As the years passed, multiple attempts were made to contact these lost soldiers. Leaflets were dropped from planes, newspapers left in the jungle, and even loudspeakers broadcast messages to the men from their families. But to Onoda and his men, these were psychological tricks. They had been trained in a strict military school to resist any deception. Even when captured comrades returned pleading for them to surrender, they remained steadfast.
Onoda was not alone in his conviction. Shochi Yokoi was another soldier who hid in the jungles of Guam for 28 years. When he was finally discovered in 1972, he famously said, and I quote, "It is with much embarrassment that I return." He had survived in a handmade cave, weaving clothes from tree fibers and subsisting on roots, rats, and small fish. It took Lieutenant Yokoi a year of counseling to adjust to 1970s Japan with its democracy, feminism, and booming economy.
Onoda was conscripted into the Japanese army in 1942, where he was selected for guerrilla combat training. As a Futamata branch of the Nakano military school, his training defied the widely distributed Senju-kun battlefield code instructions, which forbade Japanese combatants from being taken prisoner and instructed them to die fighting or via self-sacrifice instead. You are absolutely forbidden to die by your own hand, he was told upon being sent to Lubang in late 1944. As recalled in his 1974 memoir, which was entitled No Surrender, My 30-Year War. Under no circumstances are you to give up your life voluntarily. This would have been seen as a contradiction of the military code staying alive under dishonorable conditions. In order to persuade this dedicated soldier to stay alive at all costs, Onoda was told the emperor himself required his survival to bring the Filipino people into the greater East Asia prosperity sphere. Onata's mission was to destroy the Lubang airfield and appear by the harbor, plus any enemy planes or crews who attempted to land. He failed, and as enemy forces took control of the island, he and his fellow troops retreated into the jungle. The war was soon over, but the leaflets that were dropped on Lubang to inform stragglers of Japan's surrender on 15 August 1945 were dismissed as fakes by Onata and the 3 remaining servicemen who stood by him. They remained hidden in the wilderness among stinging ants and snakes, living on a diet, as we've said, of bananas, banana skins, coconuts, and stolen rice, convinced that the enemy was trying to starve them out.
Fascinating tale was made into a film by the legendary director Arthur Hanari. His film, Onoda, 10,000 Nights in the Jungle, has won acclaim all over the world and created much controversy since it premiered at the 2021 Cannes Film Festival. The people and the government kept looking for these soldiers. Search parties tried to find them for years, but Onoda assumed them to be Japanese prisoners forced against their will to look for him. Photos from family members were believed to be doctored. Onoda was not aware that his hometown had been bombed and completely rebuilt. Allied jets heard flying overhead during the Korean War between 1950 and 1953 were thought to be a Japanese counteroffensive, while newspapers dropped on the island informing them otherwise were dubbed Yankee propaganda. Onoda wrote in his memoir that as early as 1959, his comrade Kinshinzi Kuza had developed so many fixed ideas, we were unable to understand anything that did not conform to them. I can relate to that.
Kozuka was ultimately killed by shots fired by local police in October 1972, but Onoda remained on the island alone for another 18 months before an encounter with an eccentric Japanese explorer named Norio Suzuki resulted in an agreement. If Suzuki could bring Onata's commanding officer to Lubang with direct orders to lay down arms, he would comply. Suzuki's mission was a success, and Onata's war came to an end on March 9, 1974. Onata had become friends with Suzuki, who he called, and I quote, "this hippie boy." It took 6 months between their initial meeting for Suzuki to find Onata's commander, Major Taniguchi. Suzuki returned to Japan with photographs of Onata as proof of their encounter, after which the government located Taniguchi, who had become a bookseller following the war. Taniguchi flew to Lubang with Suzuki and, on March 9th, met with Onoda in the jungle and issued him the following orders.
As the orders read, in accordance with the Imperial Command, the 14th Area Army has ceased all combat activity. In accordance with Military Headquarters Command Number A2003, the Special Squadron in the Chief of Staff's headquarters is relieved of all military duties. And the third order, units and individuals under the command of the Special Squadron are to cease military activities and operations immediately and place themselves under the command of the nearest superior officer. When no officer can be found, they are to communicate with the American or Philippine forces and follow their directives. Hard stuff for him to swallow, I'm sure.
Onoda was thus relieved of duty with his honor intact, and on March 10, 1974, surrendered to Philippine forces at Lubang's radar base. On March 11th, a formal surrender ceremony was held by Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos at Malacanang Palace in Manila, and it was an international media sensation. President Marcos granted Anona a full pardon for any crimes he had committed while in hiding. Anona turned over his sword, a functioning rifle, 500 rounds of ammunition, and several hand grenades, as well as a dagger his mother had given him in 1944, with which he was supposed to kill himself if captured. Anona had held out for 28 years, 6 months, and 8 days. That is 10,416 days after Japan's surrender in 1945.
Onoda, who had been declared dead by the Japanese government in 1959, received a hero's welcome upon his return to Japan in 1974. The Japanese government offered him a large sum of money in back pay, which he refused. When money was pressed on him by well-wishers, he donated it to Yasukuni Shrine. Arthur Harari, the French director of Onoda 10,000 Nights in the Jungle, initially wanted to make an adventure film, having been inspired by writers like Joseph Conrad and Robert Louis Stevenson. But after learning of Onoda's story and reading Bernard Cendron and Gerard Chanut's 2020 book, Onoda Sul and Gure dans la Jungle, 1944 to 1974, a documentary text informed by interviews with Onoda, his family, his commanding officer, Major Taniguchi, Norio Suzuki, and the author's visits to Lubang, he realized he'd found the perfect source material. The whole story was fascinating, Hazari tells BBC Culture. It can't not strike you.
Events recalled in Cendron and Chinu's book, which are also detailed in Onoda's memoir, are brought to life in Harari's film with intimate experiences like the camp's tense rice politics and New Year's rituals, expertly interwoven with scenes of violent conflict and flashbacks to the lieutenant's indoctrination at military school. The island of Lubang is as much the star of the film as Onoda, played by Yo-Yo Endo and Kanji Tsuda. Breathtaking wide shots take in flowing creeks, verdant jungles, and blooming purple flowers, while images of tall palms over sandy shores are as evocative as the sounds of wind, rain, and wild insects. It's a captivating tale of endurance and delusion, and the film was awarded a César for Best Original Screenplay in February of 2022, and the Best Film Award from the French Association of Film Critics. Perhaps the most remarkable case was that of Teru Nakamura, a Taiwanese-born soldier who remained hidden in Maratai Island in Indonesia until 1974. Now, unlike Onoda, who had a strict military mission, Nakamura had lived in complete isolation, unaware of Japan's surrender. He was finally discovered by an Indonesian Air Force patrol. Their stories remind us of the power of belief, duty, and the psychological scars of war. In their minds, they were not lost soldiers. They were faithful warriors upholding their oaths. Their extraordinary resilience is both awe-inspiring and tragic. You know, this sort of, when we were talking about doing this, Dr. Deneen reminded me, and I do recall it, that this was touched on in an episode of McHale's Navy. They did it in a different way, in a humorous way, but the story is known only on a superficial level. We hopefully are bringing a little bit more life to it.
Yes, indeed. That's where I first heard of it. Nakamura refused to surrender even when captured. He went on a hunger strike. Even the appeals of his grandchildren did no good. He regarded himself as a complete failure. His superiors in the imperial chain of command tried to speak to him, but they would not be enough to persuade him to surrender peacefully. I don't have absolute proof of the date, but I remember seeing it on a television program in the early 2000s that somebody decided to give Nakamura an audience with Emperor Hirohito to confirm the surrender. Nakamura threw himself at his Imperial Majesty's feet, begging forgiveness for not achieving victory, begging for the right to kill himself. And Hirohito was touched and felt respect and pity for the man at the same time, assured the soldier he was a person of honor, that the Western powers were now Japanese allies, and he himself had only respect for this young man. Now think about that for a moment, friends. You're hearing from a person, your political and religious leader, that you once regarded as your God, that first off, he's not a God, he's mortal, and that the cause you killed for 3.5 decades has come to nothing. And you must now embrace a new, completely contrary worldview in a world that's been created by the people you regarded as your enemies. That must have been overwhelming. Each of these soldiers, who were living relics of a bygone age, handled this cultural shock in a different way. Nakamura found peace once he'd spent his time with the emperor. Hanada found much to enjoy materially in New Japan, but he felt the nation had lost its spiritual moorings. He coped by opening up a survival school. He brought crime victims, wayward teenagers, and Boy Scouts seeking the Japanese equivalent of the Eagle Scout Award, the Chrysanthemum Award. And each spent a week learning everything from fishing to self-defense from this elderly warrior. The climax of the students' training took place on the top of Mount Gashan in the Yamagata Prefecture, which is the home of the sacred Daiwa Shinto shrine. Hanada devoted 6 months of the year to his wilderness survival camp, 3 months to resting, and 3 months to a second project, a cattle ranch he carved out of the Brazilian wilderness, in which he raised cattle and held banquets for the poor. The question we have not yet answered is what these warriors thought to preserve. To give you the Reader's Digest version, I think they thought to preserve the larger meaning their culture had once had, the sense of the nation as a family.
All people have things they believe in, which transcends logic and is beyond reason. It gives them happiness and purpose. And we could point to a lot of different parallels in many other cultures, none perhaps as intense these soldiers endured. But this is not merely the story of a band of warriors thrust by circumstances into a world that seemed to make no sense. This story is the ultimate example of people totally dedicated to a cause larger than themselves.
What would you have done? Could you have endured decades of hardship, convinced you were still fighting for your homeland? These men lived out one of the strangest epilogues of World War II, showing how the things you don't know linger far beyond the battlefield.
I just want to thank our listeners. This is a project that meant a great deal to me personally. I don't compare myself with those men, but in my own way, just as you, Dr. Weaver, and you, Patrick, have done, we've all spent our will and our energy trying to accomplish something that in some cases seemed impossible. And we had to fight against the urge not to give up, not to settle for the easy path, and to make things happen. And each in our own way, we've done that. So I feel a sort of kinship with these men. we could talk about this for the next 2 hours, but that would bore our listening audience. So I'm just going to say thank you again. Please give us comments, leave a like, and there are many wonderful things happening both here and on our sister podcast, History Twists.
Thank you for listening to Things You Don't Know. It's a pleasure to be on.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you too, Patrick. And indeed, we do thank our listeners. And while you're thinking about it, since I'm reminding you even as I speak, please give us a like. It's really important. And subscribe. It doesn't cost anything. It doesn't put you in, getting spam mail or any of that sort of junk. We don't believe in that. But we would surely like your feedback and your comments. If you have things to say, we'd love to hear them. We always enjoy that. So for now, going to wish you a great day and goodbye.
So long, folks.